Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping inside the high-stakes control room of the global economy, where every flip of a switch can impact millions of lives.
All right, here's the game plan. We'll start by looking at the big economic warning signs. Then, we'll meet the folks in charge and check out the different toolkits they use to manage everything. We'll finish up with a really interesting new theory that might just be rewriting the entire rulebook.
So, first things first, what are those flashing red lights on the economy's dashboard? We're talking about the two big issues that keep policymakers up at night.
This is a huge question, one that economists are always debating. And honestly, the answer directly affects your wallet, your savings, your job, pretty much everything.
Yeah, it's a really tough choice, right? On one side, you've got inflation. That's where your money just poof, buys a little less every day. But on the other side, you have unemployment, where your entire income could disappear completely. I mean, both are pretty scary.
Okay, so what is inflation really? It's pretty simple. It's why $1 in your pocket today won't buy you the same amount of stuff a year from now. It's like this invisible force that's constantly eating away at your money's power.
All right, so why does this happen? Where does this pressure on prices actually come from? Well, it usually boils down to two main culprits.
So first up, you've got something called cost-push inflation. This is pretty straightforward. It just gets more expensive for companies to make stuff. Maybe energy prices shoot up or supply chains get all tangled, like we saw a few years ago. And what do? They pass those higher costs right along to you.
And then there's the other side of the coin, demand-pull inflation. This is the classic too much money chasing too few goods scenario. Everybody wants to go out and buy things all at once, but there just isn't enough to go around. A perfect example was right after the COVID lockdowns, when people had stimulus money and savings and were ready to spend, but the factories were still trying to catch up.
Okay, so when these alarms start blaring, who's in charge? Who actually steps into that control room? Well, let's meet the two main engineers, because they each have a very different set of tools to work with.
And this really lays it all out, doesn't it? On one side, you have the government. Their toolkit is called fiscal policy, and it's all about their power to tax and spend. On the other side, you've got the independent central bank, and they use monetary policy, which is all about controlling the money supply and interest rates.
So let's start with the government's playbook, fiscal policy. This is an idea that really became famous thanks to the economist John Maynard Keynes, especially in the aftermath of the Great Depression.
Yeah, the whole goal here is for the government to use its wallet, its power of the purse, to steer the economy. It can either hit the gas when things are slow or slam on the brakes when things are getting too hot. Let's talk about hitting the gas. When the economy is sluggish, maybe unemployment is taking up, the government can take what's called an expansionary stance to try and get things moving again.
And how do they do that? Well, they can spend more money themselves, on big infrastructure projects, or they can cut your taxes. The whole idea is to get more money into the system so people start spending. Now, there's always a catch, right? The trade-off is that this usually means the government's budget deficit gets bigger.
Okay, but what if the problem isn't a slow economy, but one that's overheating? What if inflation is the big worry? Well, then, they do the complete opposite. They pump the brakes with a contractionary stance.
And yeah, you can imagine this is a lot less popular. It means the government has to either cut its own spending or, you guessed it, raise taxes. The goal is to suck some of that extra cash out of the economy, slow down all that spending, and hopefully cool down inflation.
All right, now let's switch gears and talk about that other engineer in the room, the central bank. A key thing to remember is that the central bank can act way faster than politicians can pass laws. That's why monetary policy is often the first line of defense.
So what is monetary policy? It's really all about controlling the amount of money floating around the economy and, crucially, how much it costs to borrow that money. And that cost of borrowing, that's what we all know is interest rates.
And this right here shows their number one tool. It's got a fancy name, open market operations. But the idea is pretty simple. The central bank buys or sells government bonds. So if it wants to lower interest rates, it'll buy bonds from regular banks. When it does that, it's basically depositing brand new money into those banks' accounts. Suddenly, the banks have more cash to lend out, and that pushes down the interest rates for everyone.
But here's where things get really interesting. After the big financial crisis in 2008, a huge problem popped up. What do you do when your main tool, cutting interest rates, is basically useless because rates are already at zero? You can't go any lower.
Well, that's when they had to pull out the emergency toolkit. And the big tool in there is called quantitative easing, or QE.
You can think of it like open market operations, but on steroids. The central bank starts buying up massive amounts of assets to just flood the system with cash, hoping to jolt the economy back to life when nothing else is working.
Okay, so we've talked about the standard playbook, but what if someone suggested we just tear up that playbook and write a whole new one? There's a newer school of thought that's doing just that. It's called Modern Monetary Theory, or MMT, and it puts forward a really radical idea. It says that for a country that controls its own currency, the government doesn't actually have to tax or borrow money before it can spend. It can just create the money. In this view, the real limit on government spending isn't some budget. The only real limit is inflation. And if inflation gets too high, well, that's what taxes are for, to cool things down.
And that leaves us with a really provocative question, doesn't it? Now, critics of MMT will tell you this is a recipe for disaster that'll lead to runaway inflation. But its supporters say it could unlock the government's power to solve huge problems. So it really forces us to ask, could a government just print its way to prosperity, or is there always a price to pay? And that makes you wonder what the economic control room of the future is really going to look like.